everybody, 6-Speed Dakota here, and if I look like crap and sound like crap, that's because I feel like crap. But yeah, just getting sick, that's all. I put out a little questionnaire on Facebook the other day and got a couple of responses and asking what video you guys want to see next, and it was how to get your vehicle through emissions testing. So that's what I'm doing here today. I'm sitting in the truck, just kind of chilling, because there's a couple things I want to show. But anyway, so there's going to be three mini sections to this video. There's how to pass a tailpipe test, how to pass an OBD test, and how to pass a diesel test. Now, I don't know a whole ton about the diesel, but there's a few things, tips and pointers that I can give you. So let's start out with how to pass a tailpipe test. Alright, so what is a tailpipe test? Well, when you drive your vehicle in, they stick a probe in the tailpipe, they run the vehicle on a specific driving leg, depending on year and model of the year of the vehicle, and the pollutant gases coming out of the tailpipe, they measure, they give you your readings, and that determines whether you pass or fail. There's a maximum allowable for your specific year, make, and model of vehicle. So essentially what they test for is different gases. They got hydrocarbons, which is unburned fuel, carbon monoxide, which is partially burned fuel essentially, incomplete combustion, and they test for NOx, or oxides of nitrogen, and that's from efficient combustion. So the more NOx you have, the more efficient your combustion is. So if you have a lot of hydrocarbons, you got a lot of raw gas coming out of the tailpipe, which likely means that you probably have worn out plugs, spark plugs, a worn out distributor cap and rotor, or something in the ignition system is not quite firing right. You may have a dead miss on one cylinder. I've seen people go in wondering what's wrong, why it won't pass AirCare, and they got a dead miss. You'd be surprised some of the things I see. Carbon monoxide. Excessive amount of carbon monoxide is typically from running too rich. So if you got a lot of black soot, black smoke coming out of the tailpipe or something like that, good chance you're polluting a lot of carbon monoxide. So typical causes of that, if you have a carbureted vehicle, your carb might be jetted way too rich. You may have a bad O2 sensor or something, MAP sensor, MAF sensor if you have a fuel ejected vehicle. It could be all kinds of things. And really the only thing that can cause an NOx or NOx failure is a bad EGR valve, which you've seen on my F-150 video. Anyway, so I'm going to basically give you a brief description of the test, and we'll kind of go over the general problem areas of what caused what problem. Okay, so first thing you do when you drive in the AirCare facility, or at least it's called AirCare here in BC, and I know that that's a program originated in Colorado, and there any kind of other emissions testing. The first thing that they do, well, is they take your money. And then after they take your money, they'll come over here, they'll take your gas cap off, and they'll run it in a pressure testing machine to make sure that the seal is okay. Because if the gas cap is leaking, you're letting hydrocarbon emissions into the air. So once that passes the test, they come underneath the vehicle with a rolling mirror. They look at it from underneath and try to determine if you have catalytic converters in place. Another thing they do is they take your insurance and they verify that your VIN number matches in all three places. You can't really see it there. So, if we pop the hood here, grab my special light. Alright, so if we look under the hood, see that little canister thing way down there that I'm shining the light on between the steering shaft there? That is the catalytic converter. That's a very important piece because what that does is that helps clean up all the carbon monoxide and hydrocarbon emissions. There's platinum and palladium inside of there that cause a reaction that causes it to burn off to water and carbon dioxide. So if that guy's not there, you're going to be putting a lot of hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide emissions. Basically what they do, once you've driven in, is they'll stick a probe in the tailpipe. If you have dual tailpipes, sometimes what they do, I want to get my plate in there. Sometimes what they do is they'll stick a probe in each tailpipe. Now, that's kind of futile on this vehicle because it's got a single into dual exhaust. So they both should read exactly the same. But sometimes they'll measure the differences between sides. You know, I don't know specifically why. So then what they'll do is they'll run your vehicle on a driving leg. So in BC, for a vehicle that's 1992 and older, they'll run it up to about 50 kilometers an hour, about 30 miles an hour, and hold it there for about a minute or two. Then what they do is they stop the vehicle and let it idle for a minute or two. And in doing this, they measure the exhaust gas readings and they tell you whether you pass or fail. Now the standards are based on the type of vehicle, the year, make, and model, that kind of thing. So they vary between years. There's no set answer to what one vehicle pollutes more than the other. It's all set. I'm not quite sure how they set those, but it's all, I think, based on gross vehicle weight, engine size, etc., etc. Anyway, if you have a 93 or newer vehicle, when they stick it on the dyno, they run what they call the IM240 test, which is a 240-second long test, a 2-minute test. And, or is that 4-minute? 4-minute test. My mistake, I can't add today. So what they do is they put the vehicle on the dyno and they have a specific little graph that points to how fast you should be going, and they have a little line that says how fast you should be going. The little pointer is how fast you are going. And they drive it around, basically kind of almost like a city kind of driving thing. If you got a standard, there's little lines that tell you what gear to shift into. Then, when they're done puttering around, they slow down to a stop, let it idle for about 10 or 15 seconds, and then they punch it real hard, full throttle. Run it through, I think first, second, and third, at least in my S10 it was. And then, once that's done, they slow it right down, stop it, take it off the dyno, and tell you whether you pass or fail. With my S10, it was fail every time, but that's a different story. So, because 93 and newer vehicles fall under a different emissions regulations category, they have to pass a different test. And the IM240 is a harder test to pass. The simple little, like, go up to 50, let it sit there and idle is actually quite an easy test to pass if your vehicle is able to pass. So anyway, so let's talk about some of the things that if in the event that you were preparing for an AirCare or an emissions test, what you should look through. You should do, look at your exhaust system. Is it all rusty? Is it all full of holes? If the answer is yes, then they may reject you from testing if it's bad enough. So make sure your exhaust system's in good shape. Make sure that they can get a good reading, because if they get a really weird reading at all, they may question that and go delve a little bit deeper. Another thing is, make sure your catalytic converter or converters are there. I have one for either bank. Older vehicles will sometimes only have one. Vehicles with one bank usually only have one. Some vehicles have 2 in a row. Some vehicles have 3 in a row, like a Mazda RX-8 has 3 catalytic converters. Depending on how stringent the emissions category is and how badly the motor pollutes. If you got a really inefficient motor, you have multiple cats in a row, which I believe the Ford Explorer 4-liter does. Now, if you've cut your catalytic converters off in the quest to maybe gain a couple of horsepower, you're on your own. I have no real tolerance for people that do that. So, because it doesn't really make a difference. So, make sure your catalytic converter is there. And one way to check if your converter is working is when your vehicle's stone cold, fire it up for maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds. If you put your hand near the converter, it should be hot. That converter heats up really fast because of the chemical reaction that goes on, produces a lot of heat. The rest of the exhaust will be stone cold, but that converter will be fairly hot to the touch. Now, another thing you should check, if you've answered I don't know to when have my plugs been changed, when has my distributor cap been changed, when has my rotor been changed. This is a distributorless ignition, so we don't have a cap and rotor. But make sure that your spark plugs are in good condition, because if your spark plugs are worn out, your engine's not going to run efficiently. The whole point of this is to make your engine run as efficiently as possible. So make sure that your spark plugs are in good shape. Make sure that your air filter is clean. If it's dirty, your engine's going to have a hard time pulling in air. It's going to run a little bit rich, and then it's going to pollute more. Now, another thing is, also, make sure that you got good, clean fuel in it. Because if you got old, nasty fuel, you're trying to get a vehicle that's been sitting for a long time to go through AirCare, excuse me, it'll never pass. One other thing, and I can't quite remember what I was thinking of. Make sure if you can change your fuel filter that it's in good shape, because if you're starving it of fuel, it's going to run a little rough and likely pollute more. Change your oil, that's what it was. Make sure that your oil is clean, because if you got dirty oil in there, you're going to have contaminants in the oil that are going to get drawn in through the PCV valve, which is way back there, and it's going to pollute more. One other thing to do, if your check engine light's on, determine why it's on. Because it's very likely that there's some kind of sensor or something that's causing the engine to run inefficiently. That there's something wrong with a sensor or something that's causing it to run badly, which will cause it to pollute a lot more. Alright, so I get this question all the time. I got an old vehicle. I don't know if it's going to pass AirCare or not. Well, so how do I get it to pass AirCare? Well, if you got an older vehicle that you're not sure whether it's going to pass, number one, does it start up nicely? Does it run nicely? Does it cold start nicely? These are all things that you should know. If it cold starts nicely, if it idles nicely when it's cold, if it idles nicely when it's warm, if it starts nicely when it's warm, chances are you're probably okay. If the vehicle runs and drives well, doesn't shudder, doesn't misfire, doesn't backfire, any of that, doesn't smoke anything, there's a pretty good chance you're going to pass AirCare. If you want to, I don't really recommend it too much, but the one real surefire way is when the engine's running nice and warm, take a sniff of the tailpipe. If it smells really gassy or really rich, you probably won't pass AirCare. I mean, my S10 didn't pass AirCare. It kind of smelled a little nasty coming out of the tailpipe, but it ran perfectly. So it's kind of hard to gauge sometimes. Also, a lot of emissions testing corporations, they post previous results. So look at your previous results, especially if you bought a used vehicle recently. Make sure you check that before you buy it. One thing, definitely check. If you got a bunch of failures, well, you might be in trouble, but there's some vehicles that have never failed in their entire life. I've had an 87 Crown Victoria that's been sitting for years, put some fresh gas in. All I did was change a battery cable in the oil and took it in, and it passed with flying colors. So it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Now, what we used to do back before they had ethanol blended fuels, everything has to have a minimum of 10% ethanol in it now, unfortunately. Well, I guess you shouldn't say unfortunately, but, it makes gas mileage worse, that kind of thing. But the one thing it does is because ethanol burns cleaner, it reduces your emissions. So one of the things we used to do is we used to go to a Husky or a Mohawk station because they were the only ones that blended their fuels with ethanol. Just go fill it up with the whatever fuel we required. Now, about premium gas versus regular gas, I don't know if that really does anything. I haven't seen much of a difference, so I can't tell you if it does anything. Now, mind you, if you're using straight up Chevron 94, that's probably going to get you a worse reading because 94 octane doesn't have any ethanol in it. It's just pure gasoline. So if you use a vehicle that requires premium and you're using 94, you may want to drop it down to 91 for the emissions test. Another thing people like to do is they like to pour in a quart or a liter, depending on where you're from, of methyl hydrate or methyl alcohol. Now, methyl hydrate, as well as ethanol as an alcohol, burns cleaner, burns hotter, and again, reduces your tailpipe emissions. Now, if you're failing for an NOx failure, a NOx failure, it's actually going to make your reading worse because it burns hotter, your NOx emissions go up a little bit. Your combustion efficiency goes up. So, but I have seen drastic results on hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide. Now, again, if you have a bad sensor or something, that's really going to make a huge difference. My S10 had a bad coolant temperature sensor. That thing ran pig rich, idled really rough, and failed brutally the first time. After putting in the better grade gas and changing the sensor, it almost passed, but it went down dramatically from where it was. So that's my little spiel on that. But what you can do is put in fresh gas, make sure it's good quality gasoline. If you're in an area that doesn't sell ethanol blended fuels, put an ethanol blended fuel in. Now, when you get out there, make sure run your engine for a little bit, then take it on the highway and haul ass as you can, as much as you can anyway. Don't break any speed limits, don't do anything stupid. But with my S10, I always drove around with it in third gear, just letting that motor scream on the highway. And what that does is that heats that motor up real hot, which will increase its combustion efficiency, which will decrease your emissions if the engine's hotter. Also, what that does, because you're getting the engine hotter, you're also getting the catalytic converters hotter. And that will, again, reduce the amount of emissions coming out of the tailpipe, because the hotter the converter is, the more efficient it is, per se. Now, when you get there, and if there's a lineup, now, a lot of places you can check online. So, try to go there when there isn't a wait, but if there is a bit of a wait, keep your vehicle running. Don't ever shut your vehicle off. Now, one other thing, if you're sitting in the lineup and you're blowing a bunch of blue smoke, like your engine's worn out or there's something wrong with it, blue, white smoke, maybe you got a head gasket problem, black smoke, it's running too rich. If they see you blowing any kind of smoke out of the tailpipe, they'll wave you away and they will not test you. Also, if you got no tailpipe there, like it's just fallen off, they'll also reject you from testing. So be aware of that. Now, if your vehicle doesn't pass, a lot of places will give you a one-time 3-month insurance policy so that you can get your vehicle fixed. Now, unfortunately, the testing equipment's very, very expensive with emissions testing equipment. It's very expensive. So you can't really do this yourself. Typically, you got to take it to an AirCare approved shop. I know I love promoting the DIY thing, but sometimes you just have to bite the bullet. So let's talk about failures, certain types of failures. Now, if you have a vehicle that's failed for too much hydrocarbons, very, very likely you got an ignition system fault somewhere. You're not burning the fuel. So if you're really get on the throttle and you feel a bit of a shudder or a miss under load, chances are you're not going to pass. So if your vehicle doesn't run absolutely perfectly, there's a good chance you're not going to pass. So you might want to fix that before you go take it in and spend a bunch of money. And I forgot to mention one other thing is here in BC, you get charged $50 or $45, or I think it was $46, something around there, for vehicles that are 1993 and newer. They get a 2-year pass, and vehicles that are 1992 and older, they charge $23, and you get a 1-year pass. So if you have to be retested, it's $23. So that's just my little spiel aside. So if you fail for too many hydrocarbons, you likely have an ignition system fault of some sort. So chances are you probably have a distributor type ignition system. So what you might want to do is replace your distributor cap, the rotor, your spark plugs, and probably your spark plug wires if you haven't done them in a long time. Spark plugs are very key. A lot of times, I had a vehicle that failed for both hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide, and I took it for a drive. It had a cylinder misfire. As soon as I put a used spark plug in it, it passed. With a carbon monoxide failure, your vehicle is typically running too rich. Now, little things like the air filter, the oil, they help, but they usually won't make it so bad that it'll fail miserably. So, with a vehicle that's just failing for carbon monoxide, it's typically something like a bad sensor, oxygen sensor, manifold absolute pressure or MAP sensor, or mass airflow sensor, something that controls the fueling in the engine. Coolant temperature sensor, if it says that it's too cold, which usually when those things break and cause an open circuit, the computer defaults to like -40 or something like that, which is absurd. There's no way that's possible. But the computer will just dump a ton of fuel in, the thing will run like crap. So that'll cause a carbon monoxide failure. Other thing that could cause it, as well as a bad catalytic converter, as well as a hydrocarbon failure, can cause a failure as well. Now, typically when you have both hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide, it is typically a catalytic converter failure, is what I find most of the time. Now, it's not like it'll go bad overnight or something like that. These things deteriorate slowly over time. So typically when I see a vehicle that's got a long list of history, typically when they're new, they have a very low rating, and as they go through the years, they progressively get worse and worse. Now, again, that's partially due to cat deterioration. So if you think that your cat's not good, you could probably splice in a universal one for about $50. So, it's at your own discretion what you want to do. That's just what I found. Now, finally, if you have a NOx or oxides of nitrogen failure, that's most of the time, and I don't see these failures very often. They're more hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide. What I usually find is that the EGR valve, like I had in my F-150 video, either doesn't work or the passage is clogged. So, if you have a vehicle that's notorious for this, Hondas, older Hondas, V6s, and the F-150 with the 4.6, the earlier ones, they typically have a problem with the passage gunking up with carbon deposits. If you can't get enough exhaust flow through that passage into the intake, then you're going to, because that'll reduce your combustion efficiency, which will make you produce less NOx. So if you have a vacuum-powered EGR valve, which I should probably post a picture of one, and you can get up underneath it, the vacuum pot, and pull up on it, the motor should stumble and run really rough. A lot of times it'll actually just stall, especially if you have a smaller engine. Now, what I recommend doing is taking a piece of vacuum hose, sticking it on the vacuum pot on the EGR, and sucking in on it as the engine's running. The engine should, again, stumble and even stall. It should run really, really rough. If it doesn't, then there's a good chance. Also, if you feel like you're drawing on the vacuum tube continuously, or you can use a vacuum pump if you don't want to use your mouth, and it doesn't seem to hold a vacuum, chances are the vacuum pot's broken and all you need is a new EGR valve. Now, if it is holding vacuum and the motor's not stumbling at all, chances are your EGR port is pretty blocked. A lot of vehicles nowadays have an electronic EGR valve, and then these are OBD2 vehicles, and they'll usually tell you when there's a fault. So that's really all I can give you for how to pass a tailpipe test. There's no real science to it. You just got to make sure that your vehicle is as stock as possible, and it's running as best as it possibly can. Now, with an older vehicle that doesn't have a catalytic converter, typically putting a catalytic converter on will drastically improve its emissions performance. So if you're failing and you throw a cat on there, I guarantee it'll pass almost every time. That's just another thought on that. Also, if you have a carbureted vehicle, make sure that your carburetor is adjusted perfectly, especially for the idle test, because usually the jetting doesn't change too much, but your vehicle's demand for fuel at idle can change, and the idle screw setting, it can be really finicky sometimes. So make sure that that's as perfect adjustment as possible, and you should pass. I hope this is enough information. That's all I can think of, really. But if you have any questions, post them in the comments, or if you got a ridiculously long question, feel free to send me a PM on YouTube or like my Facebook page and send me a message there. I answer every question. So we're going to move on to part 2, which is how to pass an OBD emissions test.
Now there's something I forgot to mention. It's called a fast pass. And what a fast pass is when your vehicle is subjected to a tailpipe test. At the beginning of the tailpipe test, if the readings are better than the average passing reading, your vehicle will receive a fast pass, and they'll stop the test and you'll be sent on your way with a pass.
Alright, so this is part 2. How to pass an OBD2 emissions test. Now, way back in the day, all they had was carburetors. They fed the fuel using the Venturi principle into the engine. Everything was mechanical. There was nothing electronic. Not efficient, really, but they're reliable because there's nothing really to go wrong with them. But they're not efficient because they can't physically adjust themselves in order to change the fueling and whatnot for varying conditions and whatnot. So when the guys cracked down on emissions and whatnot, then came fuel injection, which was electronic. At least electronic fuel injection I'm talking about. Don't get all technical on me with the fuel injected Corvettes of the 50s and whatnot. Now, electronic fuel injection allowed a bunch of parameters to be fed to the computer would calculate how much fuel it needed, would apply that much fuel, then it had the O2 sensor, was downstream and told the computer, okay, this is just about right, but it needs a little bit less fuel, so the computer would correct for that. It had a feedback loop and basically worked itself out to where it was just about perfect. Now, OBD1, didn't work that great. Let's be honest. Anybody that's tried to work on a first-gen onboard diagnostic system knows how much of a pain in the ass they were. Every vehicle's got a different connector. Oh, sounds like we got another visitor. Every vehicle's got a different connector. GM's got its own connector, it's underneath the dash. Ford's got its own connector, it's underneath the hood. Dodge's got their own connector, I have no idea where it is. Nissan's got their own connector, Toyota's got their own connector, so on and so forth. Well, in about 1994, 1995, they came up with a system called OBD2, which was purely emissions-based. It was able to monitor the emission systems precisely and was able to give more feedback to the computer to allow it to control fuel metering more precisely and make it more simple to diagnose and fix. So essentially, the one main thing that OBD2 did is brought in this universal connector that connects this little code reader that I got will connect to any OBD2 vehicle, because the pin out here is exactly the same on every vehicle, and also the coding going into the computer and coming out of the computer, communicating with scan tools, is universal. That's what makes it nice for us mechanics that are trying to diagnose things. All I have is one code reader. I don't have 15, one for every single vehicle out there, which is kind of nice. Now, what the OBD2 system has is what we call emission system monitors. We got a catalyst monitor, EGR monitor, EVAP monitor, misfire monitor, so on and so forth. For every single emission system, it has a monitor. Now, this monitor watches over the emission system, its own individual emission system, and makes sure everything is working properly. Now, what we call, when the monitor sees that everything's working properly, it's what we call sets. It basically gives a green light to the computer, says, this is working properly. Now, if the computer's trying to set that monitor and it keeps seeing that there's a problem, it can trigger a fault if it sees that there's a problem. Something's not right, a sensor readout's not right, that monitor won't set, but that monitor says, hey, there's something wrong here, because the sensor range is the sensor value is out of its typical range, which has all been calculated and put into the computer in the program, and the fuel mapping's been burned in there. So when it's just outside its parameters, the monitor says, okay, there's something not quite right here. And it'll keep watching over it. When it gets too far out of its parameter, the computer says, okay, now I know that there's something wrong, and the check engine light comes on. So with a vehicle that's designed to pass an OBD2 test, which here in BC is anything that's 1998 and newer. Of course, you don't have to go for emissions testing if your vehicle is within the last 7 years. So my 06 just had to go in this year, unfortunately. So if your check engine light is on, you will automatically fail the test. So if you go in there with your check engine light on, you'll never pass. Guaranteed. So now, things that will, typically these vehicles are a lot easier to pass, because somebody says, oh, I'm not sure if my vehicle will pass, and I ask them what year, and they say 1998, anything 1998 or newer, and I ask them, is your check engine light on? And the answer is no. There's a very, very good chance you're going to pass. Very, very rare that you will not. Now, essentially what they do, when you roll in there, you pay them your $50 or whatever it costs. They check your VIN numbers like they did with the other test. And then they will proceed to, they check my catalytic converters. I don't know really why, because they don't really have to. They never check the gas cap pressure test. So when you roll up to they usually sit you on the dyno just in case they have to give you a tailpipe test. They ask you to step out of your vehicle. They put you in this stupid little booth, and then they plug in underneath the dash or wherever your connector is, and then they do a readout of the emission system. So the AirCare computers, interrogate the vehicle's powertrain control module and see what's going on. It checks if all the emissions monitors are set. Now, if you've had a check engine light and you've tried to clear it, chances are what doing that does is that resets all of your emissions monitors. So if they go in there and see that all of your emissions monitors, or most of them, are not set, they're going to say, okay, there's something wrong here. Sometimes they can even dig up a history code if you had a code on there. So what they'll do is, if they see that there are 0 monitors not set or 1 monitor not set, and in the readout they'll tell you what monitor is not set or what monitors are not set, they'll give you a pass. Your vehicle will pass. Some places, all monitors have to be set. Now, if you have 2 or 3 that are not set, then they'll strap your vehicle or affix it to the dyno in some way, shape, or form, however they do it in your specific area, and they'll run a tailpipe test. Now again, if your vehicle's running properly, it'll pass. Very, very likely to pass. Now, if you have 4 or more that are not set, which is highly likely that the PCM or the computer has been reset and has reset all the emissions monitors, you will fail the test. Now, one other thing is with this guy. Oops, been yapping for too long. With this guy here, if they plug in and one of these pins is power, another one is ground, and a couple more communication, if there's no power going to that outlet, into the plug, or the ground is not right, or there's something wrong with it where they can't get communication, they'll reject you from the test. Now, I'm not sure if they'll give you your money back or not. I wouldn't be surprised if they did, and I also wouldn't be surprised if they didn't. But you'll be rejected from testing if they can't communicate with it. So one good thing to do is, if you have one of these, plug it in and see. Now, this guy lights up if I plug it in. To turn the key on. Now, as we can see here, turn the viewfinder around here. We see here, there's 3 lights. There's a green, a yellow, and a red, and these will tell you the state if it will pass or not. Now, as you see these 2 things flashing. I believe one's the catalyst and one's the oxygen sensor monitor. These ones are a pain to set. Every vehicle sets differently. There we go. So in this case, my vehicle would be subjected to a tailpipe test. Now, I was able to drive it around for a while, get it good and hot, and was able to set the monitors, and went in and passed, no problem. But in this state right now, this vehicle would be subjected to a tailpipe test. Now, I very much prefer that it wasn't, because the guys there, they don't know how to drive. They also don't know how to line a vehicle up on the dyno. And, they especially don't know how to drive stick. They're all terrible. That's just my observation. The guy dumped the clutch on my S10 and almost sailed off the dyno about 3 or 4 times. Just did not know how to drive. So, that's why, again, I'd prefer that my new truck, they didn't wreck it. So, anyhow, that's my little thought on that anyway. So, again, if your vehicle is modified and you've put something like high flow cats, long tube headers, something like that, and you have a tuner, like I have my Super Chips tuner right here. So my Super Chips tuner here, this is designed for relatively stock vehicles. This thing's not really designed to program for something like a high flow exhaust or something. Now, a lot of tuners that do will typically shut off your rear 2 oxygen sensors. Now, in order to monitor things like the catalytic converters, you have an oxygen sensor before the cat and you have one after. Now, if the one oxygen sensor reads that it's fairly similar to the one that's before the cat, well, it's going to set a check engine code that's either P0420 or P0430, depending on what bank, if you got multiple banks. And this will basically mean what P0420 or P0430 means is catalyst efficiency below threshold, bank 1, bank 2. Now, for a low emission vehicle or an LEV, a P0420 or P0430 will be set when it drops below 80% efficiency. Now, for an ultra low emission or a ULEV, it will set if it's below 90%. Now, I'm not sure if running whatever in your gas tank will clean anything out. Cataclean, acetone, lacquer thinner, whatever. I've heard myths that it will. I saw Scotty Kilmer on YouTube also do something like that, and he says that it works. I never tried it myself, so I can't prove him wrong. So that's one way, I guess, of doing it. So it's actually fairly easy to pass an OBD emissions test, an OBD2 emissions test. All you really have to do is make sure your check engine light's not on. If it's never really been on, good chance you're going to pass. Also, make sure you get your vehicle nice and warm. Make sure it's running good. Take it for a drive. Again, you never want to take your vehicle in cold because sometimes the emissions monitors unset themselves to rerun their diagnostic processes when you start the vehicle cold again. So again, make sure your vehicle's running up to snuff and is warm before you take it in. Don't shut it off just in case they subject you to a tailpipe test. But that's my thoughts on that. It's fairly simple. Again, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If it's a fairly lengthy question, send me a PM on YouTube or send me a message on Facebook, like my Facebook page, and send me a message there. I answer every question. So, next thing we're going to do is we're going to move on to part 3, and that is diesels. Alright, so now we're going to talk about diesel vehicles. Now, diesel vehicles differ slightly from gas vehicles. It is they don't test your HCCO, NOx, any of that. Because what they actually test for is what we call opacity. Now, as we learned from science class, we got translucent, transparent, and opaque. Transparent is like glass. Translucent is something that you can kind of see through, like stained glass. And opaque means you can't see through it. So opacity means how opaque is the exhaust coming out? How much light can pass through the exhaust? Or how little light can pass through the exhaust. I'm not sure what the units that they measure it in, but bear with me here. So when you drive your vehicle in, they'll run it on what they call, I believe the test is called the D135 or something along those lines. It is essentially the full throttle pull version of the IM240. It's basically the IM240 with the first half just chopped off. It's a truncated version. So, and they don't really need to drive it slowly because when you stomp on it, hit the brake. When you stomp on it, that's what's going to create the smoke. If you go watch my little presentation I did last year on diesel engine fuel injection emissions technology, I outline all of that stuff and what the diesel particulate filter and stuff like that does. Now, a vehicle with a diesel particulate filter doesn't have to go in yet for an emissions test because it's only been around for 6 years now, 7 years. So, when you go in there, they'll stick the different kind of probe in your tailpipe. They'll test the opaqueness of the exhaust. Now, this is fairly easy to pass. My friend actually had a 2001 Cummins dually and had it chipped up with an Edge Juice with Attitude on it. Now, he had it down to stock, and it still blew a bit of smoke, but he was able to pass with no problem. So his reading was 6. The average passing was 3, and the limit was 30. So if it's really, really smoky, you're probably in trouble. Now, those of you that like to mod things and put the chips on them and whatnot, and big turbos and that kind of thing, well, again, you're kind of on your own for that. Because putting the tuning on a vehicle will also cause it to smoke more. Especially when you have one of those tuner chips where all you have to do is press a button and you get 100 extra horsepower, 150, whatever. Like the Smarty tuners where you have to download them, you get like 150 horsepower out of them. It's ridiculous. You can get a lot of power out of them. But all they do is blow smoke because all it can do is just dump more fuel in. And that's the way a diesel works. The more fuel you dump in, the more power you get. But again, the more fuel you dump in, the more black smoke you get. And that means you're running inefficiently. So those of you who put a bigger turbo on, that kind of thing, you add more fuel and it won't blow as much black smoke. But again, if you got your vehicle all tuned up, you got bigger injectors, big turbo, that kind of thing on it, there might be a chance you might not pass. You know, again, I'm not 100% familiar with those. Now, I know that somebody that has an injection pump, I've seen people that replace the ones on the VW, set it a little bit advanced and you get a little bit more power out of it. Also gives you a little bit more smoke. But again, I haven't seen really any diesel failures. Again, unless you really can't see the car behind you, you should be A-okay. So that's my thoughts on that. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments. If it's a lengthy question, post on or send me a PM or a personal message, or please like my Facebook page and send me a message there. I answer every question. So I hope these 3 little short segments of this video explain everything about emissions testing. I hope that I can explain it as well as I can. I have a short little clip of my truck going into emissions testing, but you can't really see it. I may or may not put it in depending on how well I feel as well while editing. So that's basically it. So the key points to remember is try to keep, if you have to emissions test your vehicle, try to keep it as stock as possible. Having a highly modified vehicle is going to be very difficult to get through emissions tests. Also, make sure it's running the best that it can. If it runs like crap, it pollutes like crap, and it's also going to not pass emissions. So again, high points, as stock as possible, make sure it's running the best. Now, again, put good gas in it. I don't know about the regular premium thing, again, but put a quality fuel in. If you're really worried, put some methyl hydrate in the tank, drive it real hard on the highway, take it in, don't shut it off when you're sitting in the lineup. These are the high points of this. If you take all these precautions, you should pass. Also make sure your check engine light's not on, because likely if it is on, it's likely a fault with one of the vehicle sensors that may cause it to not run correctly. It'll also pollute more. So I hope this was informative. I know I babbled a lot. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I love answering questions. So that's the end of it. I'm 6Speed Dakota, and you can follow me here on YouTube where I post new videos every week, or I try to. And you can follow me on Facebook. I have a Facebook fan page, facebook.com/6speeddakota. I am also on Twitter at 6speeddakota. And now I'm on Google+. Don't have too many followers on there, so please follow me on Google+ so I can have a few followers. All right, thanks for watching this babbling idiot talk for half an hour or however long it's going to be. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take it easy.